Before the appointment of a special counsel was announced last week, we spoke with former Vice President Mike Pence about his new book, So Help Me God. In our wide-ranging conversation, Mr. Pence details extensively his story up to and including the January 6th attack.
The president's words and actions in and around January 6th were reckless. The tweet that he issued the day that I was in the loading dock below the United States Senate endangered my family and endangered people that were in the Capitol and was indefensible.
Why did it take you 2 years to talk about your anger? Weren't you incandescent with rage that your family was put at risk like that?
Margaret, I was angry that day and many days since. But on January 6th, I have to tell you that I had to put that aside. The president had decided to be a part of the problem. I was determined to be a part of the solution, to work with leaders in Congress, leaders at the Pentagon, leaders in law enforcement, to do our part to finish our work under the Constitution.
You were calling and trying to get the National Guard to come in and restore order. Did you feel you had to do that because the commander-in-chief was derelict in his duties?
Margaret, I didn't know what the president was doing at the time. I wasn't at the White House. I had no contact with the president or the White House that day. But when I spoke to the congressional leaders in our first conference call, they informed me that they were getting mixed messages from security personnel. And I asked them if they wanted me to get involved, and they did.
Do you think President Trump needs to be held responsible in his events, in the events that led to January 6th and the violence of that day?
Well, I think everyone that perpetrated the violence at the Capitol needs to be held to the strictest account of the law.
What about those who fed it? What about those who gave it oxygen, the lie oxygen, to mislead people?
I'm confident that the American people will hold all those responsible at the end of the day, and history will be their judge. You know, in my book, what I tried to do is share a candid story about the evolution of that controversy. The president and I had developed. The president came to you at least 5 times. You lay it out in detail leading up to January 6th, and it's almost like you couldn't believe this because you kept telling him over and over, this is not legal, this is not constitutional. I did.
Do you look back and say, I wasn't forceful enough? I mean, what could you have done differently?
Well, I did tell the president many times that after he exhausted every legal challenge that the campaign had every right to pursue, that he should simply accept the results. The president was hearing from a cadre of attorneys who, frankly, should never have been left on the White House grounds, let alone in the Oval Office, telling him what, as the Bible says, his itching ears wanted to hear. My hope was that at the end of the day, he would come around. I remember on the night of January 4th, we had a meeting with the president and part of that legal team in the Oval Office. The president left on the helicopter. There were no harsh words between us, but he was continuing to make his case, and I was continuing to make my position clear. But at his rally in Georgia, which I watched on television, the president actually opened the rally by speaking about me.
I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
But then he paused, and he said to the crowd, no, one thing you know about Mike Pence is he always plays it straight.
And then he called you the next day.
I remember in that moment thinking he might be coming around.
But he wasn't.
My continued hope was that at the end of the day, he would recognize what our duty was on that day as the presiding officer under the Constitution to oversee the count of the electoral vote of an election that we lost, but it was not to be.
Will you answer questions about that day before Congress?
Congress has no right to my testimony. We have a separation of powers under the Constitution of the United States, and I believe it would establish a terrible precedent for the Congress to summon a Vice President of the United States to speak about deliberations that took place at the White House.
So you're closing the door on that entirely?
I'm closing the door on that. But I must say again that the partisan nature of the January 6th committee has been a disappointment to me.
The lawyers and the chief of staff to the president at the time, the Mark Meadows, who let those lawyers, you said, had no business on the White House grounds. You think no consequence? Only prosecute the people who actually physically went to the Capitol?
There are those that are speaking in defense of people that rioted at the Capitol and created the conditions where lives were lost. But I believe everyone that was rioting in the Capitol that day and perpetrating violence needs to be held to the strictest account of the law. But I do believe that at the end of the day, the American people will hold accountable those that permitted the circumstances around which January 6th was able to flourish into violence that day.
You also think the FBI executing a search warrant to take classified material from the former president's home was not the way the Justice Department should have handled it. But to be clear, were you ever personally concerned about Mr. Trump's handling of classified information?
I don't recall ever being concerned about the president or anyone in our administration's handling of classified information, at least among the senior staff, of which I had regular contact.
But if he had, he would be prosecuted, you would think.
Well, let me say, no one is above the law. But as someone that served on the Judiciary Committee for more than 10 years, having oversight over the Justice Department, I just think there were many better ways to obtain those classified materials from Mar-a-Lago than to execute a search warrant against a former president of the United States of America, something that had never happened in American history, Margaret.
And never been prosecuted. Do you think that should happen?
Look, my hope is that the Justice Department will think very carefully about next steps. I mean, this is a very divided time in the life of our nation. I think our nation needs to heal. But the idea of executing a search warrant against a former president of the United States sent the wrong message to the American people and frankly sent the wrong message to the wider world that looks at the United States of America as the standard. And that was my disappointment in the decision to execute a search warrant.
And there will be more of our conversation with the former vice president just ahead. But we also spoke with former Vice President Pence about the former president's entrance into the 24 presidential campaign and the prospects for his own run.
I look forward to being involved in the process in some way. Whether we are in the debate as a candidate or in the debate simply as an active Republican. I look forward to getting behind the Republican cause and supporting candidates around the country as well as our nominee to get this country turned back to the policies that'll make us strong and prosperous again.
That sounds like you'd prefer he's not the nominee, but you didn't say no.
Well, I just think there'll be better choices.
Mm-hmm.
I think now calls for a different time. I think the American people will want to see us move forward.
You talk about moving forward. The idea of relitigating the 2020 election continues to circulate, as you know that, amongst members of your party. Do you think that continuing to push these claims, as the former president does, is a direct threat?
The 2020 election was not stolen. We have a process in this country where states conduct elections. Questions of irregularities or fraud are then adjudicated in the courts. The states then certify electoral votes, and as we did on January 6th. But I do think there's been far too much talk questioning the integrity of our elections.
According to a CBS tally, there are going to be 156 members of Congress that will be sworn in January who continue to raise questions about the validity of the 2020 election. That's more than back in 2020. Isn't that a risk? Doesn't the party need to stop that?
There's a First Amendment in this country that people can hold the opinions that they hold, even if I disagree with them. But I have every confidence that the new Republican leadership in the Congress, the new Republican majority, when Nancy Pelosi hands the gavel to Kevin McCarthy, is going to draw the lessons from the midterm campaign, which for me give evidence of the fact that that the American people want the Republican Party, and frankly, all of our leaders, to be focused on the future.
Did it surprise you then that Republicans didn't end up with a larger margin?
I was surprised. I was disappointed at the outcome of the election. As you look around what happened on Election Day, candidates that were focused on the future, candidates that were focused on the issues that the American people are focused on, did quite well.
You're very proud of the Supreme Court justices put on the court who just recently struck down Roe versus Wade. Do you think the decision on abortion access should stay in the states, or should there be a national law banning it?
From very early on in my public career, I was determined to be a champion for life. I just always purposed to advance the sanctity of life. And I always believed that Roe v. Wade would be sent to the ash heap of history. It's interesting that Ruth Bader Ginsburg even said, it was one of the great Supreme Court justices.
Well, she
of our
questioned
time.
the legal basis.
She
not
questioned the
being
legal
solid
foundation
enough.
of it, and
what,
she was right. But
does
my
what you're talking
perspective-
about, the moral imperative,
yes.
does that trump states' rights?
Well, the Dobbs decision really gave the country a new beginning for life. And it did return the question of abortion to the states and the American people. Many alarmists on the American left in the beginning spoke about it banning abortion and taking away the right. And actually, I think most Americans figured out pretty quickly that, in fact, this question that bears so deeply on the life of the nation had simply been returned to the people and their elected representatives. For my part, I will tell you that I will always support efforts to strengthen protections for the unborn. I think it's most likely that it will be resolved at the state level, but the 15-week legislation in the Congress, had I been a member of Congress, I would have supported, because I think it actually—
That's not too liberal for you, because it would allow access up to 15 weeks of pregnancy.
Well,
that's where the majority of abortions are performed.
I would have supported it as a beginning.
The Rubio-Graham bill, the 15 weeks you're talking about, also has exceptions for life of the mother after the 15 weeks.
I supported those exceptions during my public career. But, Margaret, I do believe it's more likely this is going to be resolved at the state level. It may take as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law in all 50 states as it did to overturn Roe versus Wade. But people that know me and my family know that so long as we live, we'll seek to be about the business of life in this country and doing our part to support the sanctity of life.
I was interested to read that you and your wife, Karen, underwent IVF therapy, which is a lot to go through. And there are people who are concerned that if you start with abortion access restrictions, that it will also lead to restrictions on IVF treatment. If you believe life begins at conception, you can make that argument. Should it be protected as a right?
Karen and I struggled for more than 5 years with unexplained infertility. And in fact, I'll never forget the day that I called home, driving off to a work appointment, and Karen answered the phone and said, "Happy Father's Day." And our son would come along, then a daughter, then another daughter, all within 3 years. And we were busy but joyful. But in the midst of all of that, we also received word that we had made the list for an adoption for a young woman with an unexpected pregnancy. But we wanted to find out if the second family on the list was clinically infertile. And when we did, we stepped aside, not wanting to prevent them from having the joy of a little one in their home. But I fully support fertility treatments, and I think they deserve the protection of the law.
What about same-sex marriage? A number of Republicans are getting on board federal protections for it. Do you believe that you need to consider that when you talk about compassion?
Well, as a Bible-believing Christian, I'll always hold the view that marriage is between one man and one woman. I think it was ordained by God, and that'll always be my values. But the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on this in the Obergefell case. And
so you don't think a federal law is needed, like a number of Republicans
We can
are
disagree with Supreme Court decisions, but we can't disobey them. I respect the pronouncements of the court. And I actually think it's just as important as we go forward as a nation that we make it clear that we don't believe in discrimination against anyone because of who they are, who they love, or what they believe. But at the same time, I think we need to make sure that we protect the religious freedom of every American that's enshrined in the Constitution, the ability to live, to work, to worship in a manner according to the dictates of your conscience.
Our full interview can be seen on our website at facethenation.com and on our YouTube page.